from Streets of Growth, a very, very good charity operating principally in East London, working with young people from vulnerable communities. Darren, thank you very much for joining me this afternoon. Can you please tell us something about the origins of your organization?
Yeah, well, I have family who grew up on the council estates there going back many, many decades. So I was born onto the council estate in East London back in '67. So I grew up knowing what it was like to be around poverty, criminality, drugs, drug taking, drug dealing. Not that I got involved in all that, but I had peers and people on the estates that, you know, some of them who lost their lives getting caught up in harmful lifestyles, and tried to find and navigate my way through the council estates in the '70s and '80s, and left school with no qualifications and got a bit lost and nearly got pulled into the trappings of criminality, but managed to get on a scheme where I was in the construction industry. And it was there where I first got introduced to community work, because I was decorating a community centre near my estate. And several years later, they asked me to go back and do a bit of voluntary and a little bit of youth work. That's how I first got formally involved in community development. But being that I came from those council estates, I started to ask a lot of questions that challenged institutional and organisational approaches that fixed communities like mine, and felt that if we were really going to tackle this problem, we need to be out in those estates in real time rather than relying on getting youngsters off the streets and in projects, and then hoping that those projects would change how they lived lifestyles outside. And I saw that with a lot of young people I was working with, they were living a double life. They were getting jobs, but they were still involved in gangs and criminality when they came home and was on the estates at night. And that's how I first got drawn to going out at night, 7 days a week, basically rolling up on young people and trying to build relationships and getting a lot of hostile behaviour, being threatened, being challenged. And yeah, that's how it started, really. It was really raw.
Thank you, Darren. You mentioned that you grew up in an environment that was characterized by a high level of lawlessness, wrongdoing, and there was a point to which you were on the cusp of that. So what was special about your circumstance that allowed you not to take that next step into criminality, and in fact took a step in the opposite direction? Yeah? Becoming a force for good within the community instead of a part of the problem, so to speak.
Yeah. William, I think you touch on something that is probably most profound in my work. There's a misconception that there's an assumption that you have to have come from a gang or been in prison to change young people that are caught up in gangs. And I think that if we're going to move to prevention, you've also got to have people that have lived in those circumstances who decided not to. And what you touch on, which is a very, very intense and powerful question for me, is that I got caught up in some low-level criminality and got caught, and I had to ask myself, what am I really about? What values am I about? Who do I want to be? And that's what turned it around. I said to my mum, I never want to put you in that situation again, because you never wanted that for me. And that's not what I'm about. I'm faking it. I'm doing this to fit in with other people. And that is the trick. That is the skill I use today that prevents a lot of young men, especially, getting involved in gangs. It really comes down to, if you're really going to change someone caught up in harmful lifestyles, it doesn't matter how much money you've got. It doesn't matter how many programs you develop. It all comes down to your morals and values. If you don't have a grip of that moral compass, you will go by the wayside. So it was my values. I had to look in the mirror and say, who are you really? That's what stopped me.
That's very, very interesting, Darren. But it leads me to another question, which is about the relationship you had with your peers at that time when you decided to walk away from that problematic lifestyle. How did they react to you? Because you're living amongst them, they were your chums, they were your mates, but somehow you were choosing to move in a different direction. Did you feel isolated? Did you feel sent to Coventry? What was the emotions that you carried during that disengagement process?
Yeah, I think fortunately I had many other friends who had moved on and didn't want to be part of any harmful lifestyles. I mean, I'm saying harmful lifestyles, that sums up a myriad of things. Those that were caught up in harmful lifestyles, whether that was drug dealing, criminality, etc., they disassociate. They say hi, but they have no engagement with you. And at times you can be out in social settings and feel quite isolated, or if you're going down the street and people might say, well, you know, it's Darren, he's a bit of a do-gooder, but it can be challenging. I mean, I've been you know, trying to get young people to keep away from drugs. People have shouted out grass and things like that, and I must admit there are times where I've, you know, in the early days before I got into this work formally in intervention work as a community role model, there were times when I nearly got into fights with those that wanted to shame me or ridicule me for wanting to walk a different path. As I've got older and more mature, you see it for what it is, and it's difficult because I try and say to young people, well, look, this naturally, this happens when you're trying to live a different way. You're making people think about their wrong actions, and it's painful watching young people go through that peer pressure of, now I'm feeling isolated, but you just have to go through it. It's a natural tension that you either give in about who you're about and join the herd, or you stand and keep that dotted line and say, you know, I know you are and I'll associate, but I'm not getting involved in what you get involved in your activities. It's probably one of the toughest things to train and coach, William. It really comes down to willpower. It comes down to tenacity. It comes down to being true. It comes down to really standing for what you stand for. It really is.
Now, you work with young people, which is a very broad category. What part of that population do you target for your work? And bearing in mind that some of these young people you want to work with would have embarked on a course of criminality, I put it crudely. And part of what you're trying to do is to re-engineer their thinking in certain ways to enable them to make other choices in their life. So tell me, first of all, the population, your target population, and secondly, how you begin to work with those youngsters who've already engaged and you want to try and pull away, push away, redirect.
Yeah. So our target population is young men and young women. We call them young adult clients. That's the term we use. We say young adult clients. And when we say young adult clients, we mean anyone aged between 15 and 25 years. Now, don't get me wrong. I understand that starting to do work with young people should start the moment they're born, all the way up to, you know, but we can't do it all. So we specifically said we're going to work with 15 to 25, and we get that the majority of our clients have gone beyond prevention. They are already actively engaged in harmful lifestyles. And they either need, for their own safety, containment, i.e. a incarceration for the safety of themselves and the community, or they need alternate interventions to move it to prevention, to stop them engaging those behaviours. So we go through 5 steps, William. The first step is resistance. We know that when we go out and we try and build relationships, the young people we work with may not feel they need to change. They live that's the way it is culture, and that's the way that's the road, or that's the street. And we get that the first 3 to 6 months of trying to build a relationship, we're going to be told to go away or worse. And we train ourselves to work with that. And that's where we call it trying to build a relationship for change. We can build relationships and say hi and bye, but that doesn't mean we can develop relationships that can challenge. So the first 3 to 6 months, we're out where they hang out, where they go out, and we're constantly trying to give information about how you can live a different way. You know, we're from around here. We've got friends who have lost their lives. And we know that a lot of that falls on deaf ears, and that's in stage 1. That's where most organisations, William, would give up offering courses because no one's signing up for it. They've got to run a course. It's more about running the course than it is changing the lifestyle. So they'll go for other young people that want to go on a course. Okay. We don't. We're working with lifestyle. Then it moves to step 2, which is they start to think about what we're talking about. And we have to continue going in and rolling up on them and turning up where they don't least expect us. And that continues in that sort of 3 to 6 months until they start to say, well, if I did that, what would it mean? And that's when we get them to stage 3, where they start to think and plan about how to move away from those behaviors. Now, in that, on one sense, we will say, well, this is a course. If you want to be a decorator, or if you want to go into hair and beauty, or you want to be a politician, we would have steps and stages for that from week 1 to year 3. However, we also have year 1 to year 3, where we go back to what you mentioned at the beginning, which is what are the peer pressures and tensions you're going to face as you start to pull away and work on these courses to develop your career. So we're working with lifestyle and we're working with career in a 3-year process of stage 1, 2, and 3. Then stage 4, when we feel that they've developed an effective plan, we move into the action of that plan, where they start making informed choices and coming in. And they may still disappear and come back and be like what we call yo-yos. They turn up one day, don't turn up the next. But then we move it into stage 5, which is maintaining and sustaining. And that's the 3-year process. So it goes step 1, they resist us. Step 2, they consider. Step 3, they plan. Step 4, they engage. Step 5, they can be self-sufficient and lead their change without us. And that's the model we use, called the appropriate intervention bridging model.
That sounds fascinating, and I'm really interested in the 5 steps. Is it possible for you very, very briefly to break into each of those steps, just to give us a small insight what those steps could look like, what they contain, the kind of activities, behaviors, relationship, whatever that's contained in each, just an example of each of the 5 steps, just to deepen our understanding.
Yeah, no problem. So step 1, that would be where we show up and we go out. We go into any environment, in the streets, knock on their doors, may even sit in their living room with a father who says, my son or daughter needs help. And we know that that's all based on other people wanting change for them. That's not them wanting change for themselves. So we get that they're going to be very hostile environments. That's where we try and find out where they're hanging out, what they're up to, and it kind of freaks them out, because they're like, why would you come out at 1 o'clock in the morning while I'm hanging out by this car? And they're quite fascinated and intrigued, because they're used to scaring organizations off. You know, we don't want to come on your course, don't come back, or you'll get that, and they start doing the threatening and whatever. And they're used to organizations saying, oh, you can't work with them, they're not ready. Well, we get that they're not ready, so we go out because we're ready. So we'll go out, and that's really about learning not to take it personally. We get that we're trying to talk to people where it's falling on deaf ears, and there may be some very hostile behavior. We get that. So it can be quite uncomfortable for people that are not comfortable with this work. They would find that quite personally attacking. They would take it too personal. So there's no glitz and glamour to it. It's basically continually to go out there. Then all of a sudden, stage 2, you start to see what we call a beginning of reciprocation. They might say, oh, hi, yo, Darren, how you doing? And you're like, oh, okay, how you doing? You all right? Remember the chat we had the other night? And yeah, I thought about it, you know, tell me a bit more. And they start to inquire, but that doesn't mean they'll engage. This is the mistake a lot of organizations make. The moment they speak to a young gang member who says, you know, I want to talk to you, straight away their next step is, well, there's this 6-month program. And then they wonder why you know what I mean? And it's a waste of money because they're not ready. So stage 2 is more about continuing from that hostile behavior and then starting to seek us out. And they, can we speak to you? Because their emotions are being flicked between wanting to be involved with ARM, and that guy and girl's offered me some opportunities for a different life. Then step 3 is where they start to say, you know what, can you meet me when I'm not with my peers? Like, can you come to my house? Or can I come into your centre? Because I can't be seen to be having these conversations. Because if they see me doing this, they'll know that I'm now making plans to move on. So that can be, we have to be very careful with that. I mean, give you a situation, there was an example where a youth worker had a chat with a young person on our estate, and just because they were considering change, went over to them the following night when they were with gang members and went, are you coming on that course? And then the gang member whacked the kid and went, I run things around here. What course are you going on? So you have to be very strategic to protect their privacy.
Yeah.
Step 4 is when we say, okay, then we'll design a action. This is when they go into action. Let's do a 1 morning workshop. Let's do a 1 hour taster session. Let's do a 1 day warm-up class, just to see if they'll come and they'll commit. And if they blow out, we go back to the street and say, hey, what happened? Why didn't you stay on the course? Why didn't you come in? But it's not a 3-month, 6-month course. It's just a taster. So the action stage goes from early intervention of bringing in a 1-hour course, a 1-day course. Then we'll build them up to a 1-week course. Then we'll build them up to a 2-week course. Then we build them up to a 4-week course. And when we know they've got that resilience, we can then speak to other organisations about going on, GMVQ, whatever courses are out there. That's stage 4. And that could be anything. You name any industry in the world, and we'll work with organisations to get them in it. If a young person came in and said, I want to be in the Olympics to be a tobogganist, I will go and find a professional tobogganist. Because there are young people out there on the States who will never get to realise who they want to be because they never meet the people that can help them. So we're very open to finding who can help them rather than saying, oh, just do air and beauty and careers. We try and go for any trade.
Okay, that's fascinating, that your views to date. In terms of the people you work with, how long does it take to get from stage 1? And I know there's no absolute because everybody's different, but roughly from stage 1 to stage 5, is that a 1-week process? I'm being stupid, or is it a year's process?
Okay. Let's look at some of our long case scenario, and then I'll go to the short case. So long case scenario, our track record is 1 to 3 years with someone that's hardcore and seriously involved in harm.
Right.
Stage 1 to stage 2, i.e. resistingness to then thinking about change, takes anywhere between 1 and 6 months. Moving to stage 3 where they're planning is 1 to 9 months. Engaging the action and change then starts there. Now, a young person caught up in gangs and stuff, they may take anywhere between 1 and 3 years. However, we've worked with gang members and they've gone from 1 to stage 5 in 12 months.
Okay.
So it really comes down to the depth of harm they're involved in and how entrenched that harm is and become normalised. For instance, if you've got a young person whose father's involved in drug dealing, when they go home, there's no escape. Whereas if it's a young person from a decent family where the father and mother isn't drug dealing, they've got less pressure to stay in it. So it's very difficult. I mean, we've worked with young girls caught up in harm and they've moved through our model in 1 to 7 months.
Okay.
So unfortunately, William, when we say to funders it could take 1 to 3 years, they often say that's too long. But the problem with that is we've then seen those young people on other courses and they're going from course to course to course, and 10 years later, they're still involved in drug dealing. So, I think 1 to 3 years is pretty good when you consider it's taken a young person 25 years to get to that state of lifestyle.
I completely see that, for a young person who's deeply embedded in a particular way, living, seeing the world and themselves, to get from that position to somewhere where they're at stage 5. It's a remarkable achievement in 3 years. And that's one of the challenges, that too many people, as you've indicated, are looking for easy wins. And in reality, there are very, very few easy wins. What there is a lot of intelligent, hard work with young people who at the outset, as you've clearly indicated, are resistant. Tell me, in terms of the success, and we'll come on to success in a moment, that you've had, the involvement of the parent or carer, does that make a difference in terms of the speed in which a young person moves through your 5 stages?
Yeah, because it means that when, we're this side of the street door and we're knocking and we're talking, and we need people the other side of that street door reaffirming what we're doing and also using what we do to help them become better parents. So we sometimes train the parent in our, what we do, if they're open to it, we change them in the 5 stages of intervention. So we say, when they come in, don't start by going up into the bedroom yelling and shouting, because they're just going to shut the door. The role that we have is how we keep that door open. So a lot of parents have found it really useful learning our intervention coaching to parent. and that's been very useful. Unfortunately, when you come from environments like me, like where, you know, parents themselves are long-term unemployed and are ducking and diving to keep a living, you got a stuck young client and you've got a stuck parent, and that can be really difficult. I mean, we've had successes with our young clients, and we've created a different tension where they've fallen out with parents because parents have become embarrassed by their own behavior. So rather than look at themselves, they've thrown the young person out and said, you make your own way. So it can be for and against. There are times where there are things that we can't tell parents because they would talk to people and give them information that would completely wreck our approaches. So we're not able to share certain information that we'd love to share with them because they can't hold it, and they will go and speak to the very people that would undo 3 years worth of intervention work and put that young person in harm.
Yeah, I've come across cases where I've been working with young people and the parent, usually it's a single parent, has been opposed in terms of their own lifestyle. So their lifestyle is saying one thing, yet they understand that their lifetime is not going to be in the best interest of their young person. Yeah. So they're quite prepared to support, to have a double life in a sense, to support the work we're trying to do in terms of interventions. Yeah. At the same time, they maintain their own lifestyle, but they're quite clear that this is what I'm doing. It's all I can do. It's wrong, and I don't want you to follow in my footsteps. So listen to X and Y. Have you come across cases like
every single day? And there are we've studied this, William. We've put a lot of research into that question and point you raise. We liken it down to two words. It's all down to threat and embarrassment. They're embarrassed to accept that they need to change it and start to change it is so embarrassing and threatening that they almost become detached to it and say, well, look, I know I live like this, but I don't want it for my son or daughter. And it's a very, in some cases, William, it's where we call that behavior traumatized. It's become normalized. It's that normalized of how they live that lifestyle that it's so normalized they won't change it. If they really saw that this was not a normal way to be, you would try and make a shift to say, you know what, this isn't right. But we've seen parents live in certain lifestyles which you would never teach a young person. And you would expect that a parent wouldn't have a child if you're living that way, because you're not keeping them safe. Hence why we have social services that sometimes have to move in to protect the child and get the parents the support they need. But we see that every single day.
Yeah. Darren, the way you go about your work seems to me to be extremely, if I say labor intensive, it's a shorthand for it takes a lot of people to raise one of those young people. Now, how much support do you have in the organization? What's the size of your staff team? And how do you recruit staff to work alongside you?
Yeah, we have nine in the main team. 9 people in the main team, slowly building to 10. And we have a trustee board and patrons who help us link to organisations to try and bring in private funding, because the funding that we get is too short term and too inconsistent. And the competition for funding is so rife now. The best organisations that lead the work often get nudged out because of competition. So it's not a massive organisation, and we are asking questions about how big we want it to be, because we know organisations in other parts of the world that have gone from 9 to 10 to 90, but then you've got 5 to 10 million overheads, and you say to yourself, well, so we're really being cautious about what scale means. But we are looking at it at the moment with our theory of change and business model. But in terms of getting people to come in, there are a lot of people attracted to what we do, William, even youth workers. And then when they start doing the training to see what the thinking is behind what we do, and then they see the hours we put in to do it, and it's way beyond the paid 9 to 5, they often don't have the stamina. They don't have the conviction. and they don't have the bottle.
Yeah.
I mean, I've worked with some of the best youth workers in London, but when they come into our model, they get stage fright, because it's asking them to go beyond, well, I'm coming up to you because I'm paid to just being a neighbour walking up to a group of young people saying, look, I want to be part of this community, but in a good way. I see what you're doing is harm, and I don't want to see you in harm. And having people being quite hostile, it's we probably get through about 5 or 6 members of staff to get the one that can cope and manage the work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you can't really discover the one who's going to make it through an interviewing process. It's quite good getting rid of the extreme, but when it actually comes down to tenacity, that grit that is so important to your work, and that sense of ownership of the cases. So it's not just being very professional, it's beyond that. It's that level of caring, that level of ownership that is so important in the approach that you have. Understand that. In terms of the range of work you're doing with your team, Darren, which seems so important, how do you measure success? How do you measure that all of this fantastic activity, all of this brain power that goes into informing your day-to-day practice, how do you assess the difference it's making in the lives of the young people and your wider community?
Yeah. Well, at the beginning, when we set Streets of Growth up in 2001, we'd previously done youth work for another organisation, and we could see that a lot of things were measured was around how many young people get a job, or how many young people finish a course or sign up to a course, how many were women, how many were men, how many were white, how many were black, and you get all those statistics. When we set Streets of Growth up in 2001, we recognised that the funding for our work only recognised measuring what we call outputs. And this is really crucial what I'm going to say here, because outputs, when I say only measuring outputs, it's like who went on a course, how many were 15, how many were 20 years old, how many went on to get a job. But none of it was measuring the 1 to 6 months when we were knocking on the door, trying to build relationships. And also when we got them jobs, what work we were still doing to still try and keep them away from a gang, rather than using the job to launder money. So we started to look at a measuring model that measured 2 things. 1, it measured outputs, getting a job, finishing a course, but 2, proved that it measured the change of lifestyle, which is an outcome. The outcome of no longer going out at night and getting pulled into peers. The outcome of getting up in the morning rather than sleeping till 2 in the afternoon. All those little things. The outcome of no longer carrying a weapon. The outcome of no longer feeling threatened to carry a weapon. Things like that. And we worked with an organisation in Boston around building a model called efforts to outcomes. So we built a measuring tool that measured efforts as well as outcomes and outputs. Efforts. So for instance, I could tell you, William, that working with Mary, it took 17 door knocks. It took 18 rucks and rows on the street. It took 16 visits going to the college and saying, she's not here, I'm going to go to a house and bring her here. All those little things that take up so much time that colleges and output-driven organisations don't want to know. Output-driven organisations only want to know if they're going to come, and are they going to attend, and are they going to finish that course. A lot of those organisations haven't got a clue what's going on when they go back and they're being abused by their father. Not a clue. So our model measures lifestyle change, education, career, and changing environment. 4 key pillars.
Yeah. One of the things that, and that's very interesting what you've just said, Darren, or in fact, everything you said is very interesting. One of the key drivers for change, I think, it's youngsters coming to realize their own agency, their own power to impact their own lives. So they don't have to follow the herd. They can make their own decisions. But that takes some doing in your environment. So the generation of that mindset, that skill, to believe in yourself, that tenacity, that resilience, that's what you're trying to input or create a space for these young people to acquire those skills. You can't force this stuff into people. I understand that.
Yeah, you can't force it, and some people think some people who misunderstand our step 1 and 2, you know, that going out there, they think that we're trying to force change. We at Streets of Growth recognise you can't force change, but what you can do is turn up for a young person when they're not mentally turning up for themselves. They're out there being engaged. So we're actually turning up saying, okay, so you're rucking with me, you're fighting with me over not changing, but while I'm here, you're staying safe. I'm actually turning up because whether you agree with me or not, I think you're in harm's way, and I'm just going to be explicit about it. You can't be, you know, if you're about carrying weapons and if someone comes to you, you're prepared to kill them before they kill you. That's not about living, that's about dying. And until you recognise that that lifestyle is about dying, you're never ever going to down arms.
Okay.
You know,
Darren, so it's been a real education and joy speaking with you about the work of your charity and some of your approaches. Is there, before we conclude this conversation, is there any additional information you'd like to share with us about your unique approach to working with challenging young people in these fractured communities?
Yeah, there's one point I'd like to make. Well, actually, two points briefly, William. Thank you. The first point is this: I came into this work untrained. I was in the construction industry, and most of my training comes from growing up on those estates. That has been what I really draw on. That's not to say that I haven't then done courses and trained, but one thing I recognise that really, when I went into the construction industry, they taught me how to use brushes and rollers and tools. Yet when I came into this field of work called community development intervention, I was shocked as a local guy sitting with professionals that the one thing we never understood was adolescent brain development. So when I brought out a brain and said, so what do we know about that? People didn't even know what a limbic system was. And I'm like, in Streets of Growth, we've got to learn how adolescent brains develop so that we can help them understand how they think. And by just looking at that one simple concept, and I'm no brain specialist, but I'm able to sit down with young people now and my team and say, do you realise that there are basically two brains going on in your head? One that mentally says you should do this logically and linear, and there's an emotional brain that says, no, you need to carry a knife and stab them. How do you work with the gang within? Because until you can get those both parts, that mental and emotional, to align, you're always going to be led by emotional harm.
Right.
So that's one point with Ray. So one thing we're looking at the moment is trying to lead on neuroscience for frontline street work. So that's one thing we're looking at as our growth. The second point I'd like to close on is young people feel that they're involved in disengaging or disconnected systems. And yet Streets of Growth doing intervention work, we feel that in terms of intervention work, we're in a disengaged, disconnected system. So we've got to try, and if we're going to really thrive as an institution that helps young people, we've got to now focus on how we change systemic cycles. That, you know, the way funding's put out, the way we're forced to compete, and it's not creating collaboration, it's creating harm. It's creating cliques. Big organisations can't afford to take little scraps of funding, so they're going to government saying, give us all the tenders, we can run it all. And they're not big enough to run it all. This problem is social. That's why, William, when I met you the other day, my approach to this is how we empower communities to change it themselves so they're not stuck and dependent on institutions that are stuck on funding.
Yeah. Very profound, very profound. Well, on that note, can I warmly thank you, Darren, for having this conversation with me today and representing so well your work and the work of your colleagues. There's no doubt in my mind from this conversation that you are making a sizable difference in the lives of people. And I'm grateful. I think society ought to be grateful because by helping those individuals, you're helping all. Thank you so much, and congratulations on your success so far. Thank you very much.
William, thank you so much. I fully understand that it's very difficult to explain all this work in 20, 30 minutes. And I've tried my best to do that, but it's, the bottom line for me is hope and possibility, truth and transparency. That's it. If we can work like that as professionals and as communities, you'll build belonging, generosity, competency, independence, and interdependence.
Lovely, lovely. Thank you so much, Dan.
Thank you,
And
William.